When we're talking about alternatives to detention and alternatives to incarceration, Bob Listenby, who I believe you're going to hear from today, is going to talk about his Smart on Juvenile Justice and the work that he's doing there. And right now it's small, but something that we are going to continue to build on. And we're going to build on the evidence base that is set up by this program to ensure that we are being not just smart on crime, but smart on juvenile justice, and just smart in general. And that's something that we have to do. Now, there are kids who are going to be detained, and there are kids who are going to be incarcerated. And we have to make sure that when we do that, that we are making sure that they are getting the educational, the mental health, the skills programming that they need. And we have to make sure another special population are kids with disabilities. And are we making sure that every single facility that we have is ADA and IDEA compliant? If we're not, then we have a problem. We have to make sure that we're providing for those kids so that when they get out, they have the same opportunity as every other child. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, who has really done an amazing job and someone who I will dearly miss when he leaves, but I think Loretta Lynch is going to be amazing when she takes his place. But he spoke about solitary confinement in juveniles. It's something which we have to really take a hard look at. Why would we ever put a juvenile in solitary confinement? Why would we ever take someone who we already know, and Dr. Steinberg will talk about, is not mature enough to make some of the decisions that need to be made? Why are we going to put them in a situation where they are likely to come out worse? We have to look real hard at why we, as a country, are going to do that. And when they get out. And when kids get out, we have to look beyond the box, like the EEO guidance says. Many of you know this is ban the box. We have to make sure that they have a real opportunity to succeed once they're out. And we have to take a real close look at the 40,000 collateral consequences that the ABA counted for people who are formerly incarcerated. 40,000 collateral consequences. If you take a look at it, let me use a scientific word for them. They are silly. They are things that just simply do not make sense, that you are going to prevent a person from getting a job who is qualified for that job but made a mistake. Okay, they've made their mistake, they've paid their price. It is time now to give them an opportunity for themselves, an opportunity for their families, an opportunity for their communities. Now, it is not just about the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system, and we're making a big mistake if we think it is. It's about housing, it's about jobs, it's about human services, it's about schools and education. That's what I talk about. It's not just front end, it's not just back end, it's all ends. We have to be working at all of this stuff at the same time. I think something that we have to look at real closely is the President's recent proposal on community colleges. How many of our kids, if they have this chance to get a free education at a community college, are going to do so much better? How much are we going to improve our communities if we make sure that everyone has this opportunity to get the next step in their educations? And we have to look at people's parents. Again, it's not just front end, it's not just back end, it's all ends. We have some wonderful bipartisan legislation that is going around this hill, that went around the last Congress and is likely to be raised again. But it cannot just be back end, it cannot just be front end. It has to be all ends. And we have to make sure that the legislation that comes through that deals with criminal justice and juvenile justice impacts and makes life better for all of our kids. We look at, through my work, children of incarcerated parents. It's a group that is traumatized by what happens to them. Imagine if your parent is taken from you, locked up, and you know where they are, but you cannot see them day in and day out. Imagine what that does to you as a child, and we have to make sure that we are protecting those children in every way possible. I mean, it's about jobs, it's about minimum wage, it's about family, it's about all of these things. So just one thing, and I know I don't want to talk too much longer here, but the President has spoken a lot recently about community trust and the importance of community trust between law enforcement and the communities that they protect and serve. And so we have the Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which is going to provide a report to the President on March 2nd, which is going to talk about real ways that we can impact and improve community trust. Because if the young man and young woman on the street trust their law enforcement officers, our communities will all be that much better. We're also conducting what is called an equipment review, and that is looking at the equipment that is used in these communities and whether or not those impact trust in a negative way. And how do we use that, the money and the equipment that state and local law enforcement agencies are receiving to make sure that people are properly trained in how to use that equipment. We're also looking at body cameras. And body cameras are not a panacea. No one will tell you that they're a panacea, but it definitely answers a lot of questions about an interaction between a law enforcement officer and a citizen when you have that on camera. It answers a lot of questions, and we are endorsing that, and we are going to put some money behind that to make sure that more and more law enforcement agencies have body cameras. So the last thing I want to say is we have this My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge. Over 100 communities around the country have stepped up to take this challenge. And this is to look at not just the front end, not just the back end, but all ends of their systems to make sure that all youth can succeed. If your community is not doing this, you need to take a real close look at why. Because this isn't brain science. This is actually pretty simple stuff. This is making sure your kids have an education. This is making sure your youth has a job. This is making sure your youth stay out of the criminal justice system. It is a good thing to do. And there's going to be a lot of free technical assistance, and there's going to be a lot of silo busting that is going to happen with this to ensure that you get this right. So I encourage anyone, if your community is not involved in the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge, to take a look at why. And if there's not a good reason why not, then you should join up. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate all of the work that everyone in this room is doing. You are doing incredible work to make this community, this country, a much, much better place. So thank you very much.
And I'm delighted to be here, and let me echo the thanks that, to Christine and her Vera colleagues for putting on a remarkable set of activities and programs over the years that Christine led the Washington office. The briefing series that we've had, I think, has been fabulous. It demonstrates, indeed, how far the field has come over the last decade. And it only serves to remind us of what a critical stage we are in juvenile justice reform in this country. Indeed, when MacArthur entered the field more than 10 years ago, nearly 15, actually, we came in at another critical moment in juvenile justice when the field, in fact, was in crisis. And while we did recognize, in fact, that kids are not adults, the legal implications of that were unclear. And so we were in a moment in our history back in the late 90s where we saw increasingly states moving towards treating young people as if they were no longer young. More and more juveniles entered the adult criminal justice system, and even those that remained behind in the juvenile justice system were subject to more harsh and punitive sanctions. So that was when MacArthur, in seeking to reverse the tide, if you will, started a research network on adolescent development and juvenile justice. And we were fortunate to have that distinguished group chaired by Larry Steinberg, and he'll tell you about that work. But in fact, what that research demonstrated was that there are legal implications of how kids are not adults, and that framework would be important in thinking about how to improve and change the juvenile justice system so that it was more fair, more just, more effective, and produced better outcomes for kids, their families, their communities, enhance public safety, and very importantly, save the taxpayer dollars. So we set off on a course building on that research to demonstrate, in fact, what a developmental approach to juvenile justice, what that would look like. We wanted to show, in fact, that if state and local jurisdictions moved in this direction, that they would deliver in terms of improved public safety, better outcomes, and save the taxpayer dollars. So we started working with some states across the country to demonstrate that, in fact, regardless of a state's starting point, you could accomplish great changes in your juvenile justice system, that it was more fair and effective and rational to recognize how kids are not adults. We saw the formation of new alliances and networks, new leaders emerge in the field so that you had practitioners, policymakers, legal scholars, youth themselves and their families promoting and working towards juvenile justice systems reform. And we saw the payoff of those efforts. We've seen arrests come down, more kids diverted from the system entirely. Those who do go into the system are getting more evidence-based practices. The numbers of kids who are incarcerated has gone down dramatically. There's been a host of laws and policies that have changed, covering everything from raising the age in states like Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Illinois, to closing down large institutions in New York, Ohio, and Texas, and having public safety enhanced and save the taxpayers' dollars. So it's really clear that there has been success in systems change. But we recognize and that systems change can't accomplish, as Roy has said, by just working on the criminal and the juvenile justice system. It takes the child welfare system, the mental health system, the education system to be aligned to help some of our most vulnerable youth succeed and become successful adults. So juvenile justice reform, or juvenile systems change and improvement, it's not the same as having a scientific breakthrough that accomplishes dramatic changes overnight. It's something that you have to continuously work on. And what we are hoping to achieve as we enlist more in these efforts is to both secure as well as sustain the progress and continue to make improvements for our young people. Now, we know that there will be moments of crisis in this field. Given the timeliness of news reports, there's always something that needs to be responded to. But I think the field today, because of efforts of people like all of you in this room, is much more resilient than it was in the past when crises would occur. Indeed, we have a path going forward. Last December, the work that MacArthur has supported brings together all of the people from the different states that have been working on juvenile justice reform. And we had over 400 people from 40 states participating in our meeting. It was very diverse. We've started with our core states, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, and Washington, expanded that to 16 states that were working on specific issues related to juvenile justice reform. And then with partnerships with OJJDP and SAMHSA, we've engaged other states. So now Models for Change has touched something like 40 states across the country, in both blue states and red states. It's been resilient in the reform efforts through changes in administration and changes in leadership. So the landscape has changed. We have signposts, guidance from a host of different actors who previously didn't think that much about juvenile justice. So we have the National Research Council providing a blueprint for how the federal government's role is important with respect to juvenile justice. We have the Council of State Governments issuing its reports and providing guidance. We have policy analyses by groups like Justice Policy Institute, which wrote a report talking about sticker shock, about the costs of incarceration, not only in terms of their fiscal costs, but their social costs. The Texas Public Policy Foundation came out with a report about doing time without doing a crime. Sorry, Vikrant, that talked about locking up status offenders and how that was a wasteful use of taxpayers' dollars. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has come out with a report talking about how to improve young people's relationships with the police, as well as what law enforcement can do to promote a more fair and just juvenile justice system. The National Center of State Courts, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National League of Cities, the National Association of Counties, all of these organizations have come up with statements about how juvenile justice is important to everyone. So I think we have the momentum. I think we have the leadership. I think we have alliances. I think the state and local jurisdictions will continue to work on these issues. I think there's a recognition of what needs to be changed and why. But they're still struggling out in states across the country with different resources and different capabilities about, okay, you've told me what to do, now how do I do it? And that brings me to talking about what a reinvigorated federal role and leadership can provide. It's not to mandate or dictate what those changes should be. It should be building on the progress that has already occurred and making those resources more widely available. Because justice by geography is not justice. So I've been very pleased to see the bipartisan interest on the Hill, as well as in state legislatures, in moving in this direction. And I hope that with the opportunity to look at the reauthorization of JJDPA, and I'm encouraged by the bill that was dropped in last session, that the work in the field in juvenile justice will come under scrutiny, will decide what the appropriate federal role is and pursuing continued progress, that the system is held accountable for producing good outcomes, and that we can see this momentum in juvenile justice continue. Because I'm confident that continued progress is possible, not only because of how far we've come, but how that progress was made with a broader coalition. It's not a partisan issue. It's about young, vulnerable people who make mistakes. Now, MacArthur is a foundation. So we have initiatives, we have goals and strategies. I've been fortunate to work at a foundation that takes the long view and makes a substantial financial commitment to working on change and improvement on big issues and problems. We recognize that it's important to meld research, policy, and practice. We invest in people who are willing to take risks, who want to be creative and innovative and pursue difficult goals. But we are a foundation, and we change our focus after a period of time. And we are exiting the field. And we've been pleased to see what has grown up with not only our contributions, but the work of the Pew Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Public Welfare Foundation. But at a certain point, the foundations will move on. And we would like to ensure that the infrastructure and the support and the organizations that we have been working with will be able to continue their work. Because it's particularly important that all young people today grow up to be successful adults. And when kids make mistakes, that they're held accountable, treated fairly, and put back on the right course. And it's particularly important for young people of color to see our justice system as a justice system for all. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to hearing from the experts who have much more profound things to say about juvenile justice than I can. But I'm delighted to be here and hope we can continue to have these conversations. Okay, it's time for the switch again. So I'm not done yet. I get to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Howard Spivak, who's currently the Deputy Director and Chief of Staff at the National Institute of Justice. Before joining NIJ, he was the Director of the Division of Violence Prevention at the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the Centers for Disease Control. Dr. Spivak began his career as Director of Adolescent Services for the City of Boston, during which he co-founded the first community-based public health youth violence prevention program in the nation. He moved on to become the Deputy Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, where he was in charge of all prevention and community-oriented programs in the department. He's held a number of senior academic appointments, including Professor of Pediatrics and Community Health at Tufts, and has directed pediatric and adolescent primary care programs at several academic medical centers. He's published widely and extensively on youth violence, spoken around the country and internationally on violence-related issues. So he has a very distinguished history in adolescent medicine, public health, and he will tell you how he happened to end up at the National Institute of Justice. Dr. Spivak.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and I have to say, I need to, not out of self-interest, but I need to start by explaining why I'm at the National Institute of Justice. Since when I tell people I'm a pediatrician and this is what I'm doing, I get very perplexed looks, and in fact, that's what happened even this morning when I talked with several people when I got here. But I think it's an important illustration of the kind of change that's taking place in the criminal justice system and in the Department of Justice. You know, when I met with Carol Mason, who's the Assistant Attorney General for Programs at the Department of Justice, about this job, I said to her it was rather bold of her to be considering a pediatrician to be a senior leader for the research unit in the Justice Department. And she looked at me and she said, it's not bold at all. It shows how we're changing our thinking. And it's important that we begin to look at how we respond to things more broadly and in a broader multidisciplinary way. So this doesn't say anything about me as much as I think it says something about the evolution and movement of the justice system in this country, and it's something that I find enormously hopeful. Now, I'm not going to talk very long, and I'm certainly not going to get into a whole lot of the science of this, because all I'll do is embarrass myself, since there's people who have done much more of this than I have. But there are a couple of points I would like to make, and this is in the context that Bob Listenby actually isn't going to be here today, so I'm representing him, among others, from the Justice Department. But I've been around long enough that when I was in medical school and doing my fellowship in pediatrics and adolescent medicine, I was taught that everything was over by age 3, that the brain was developed, it was done, the damage was done, or the success was done, and everything was just fine or not fine. But there was not a whole lot you could do after that. And that's totally ridiculous. And in fact, the science has evolved and become much richer, and we know it's not done at age 3. And we know, in fact, that there's a lot going on in brain development during much of adolescence. The brain is continuing to grow. There's neural pathways developing. There's new circuitry going on. And it, in fact, is an enormously important time to create change and to support healthy development, even in the context where bad things have already happened. And that's a huge change and an important change and an important understanding. We've also learned a lot more about the other things that influence brain function and emotional responses to things. So it's not just brain activity, but there's all this hormonal stuff going on in adolescence, which can make people quite crazy, actually. I often talk about this, that kids wake up in the morning and look at the mirror and they're not even sure what they're going to see. That's a very important thing to think about, because it's a confusing time, and it's a difficult time, and it's a perplexing time, and kids need a lot of support and a lot of help during this period. And the mistakes who is sitting in this room who hasn't done something incredibly dumb as a teenager? We repress this because Lord knows we don't want to remember this stuff. But we all did this stuff. And for us to not extrapolate from our own experiences how we should be looking at young people would be a very unfortunate consequence of this. There's two other important things that I want to point out that I think have been alluded to today but haven't been mentioned, and that is there are other things that influence this besides the brain development itself. There's a whole complex of experiences that young children have, traumas and exposures that they have, that actually affect brain architecture. A lot of this work is as old as 20 years ago, and yet it still amazes me how few people really know about this stuff. But what we know, in fact, is that these early experiences not only can change brain architecture, and the part of the brain that's most affected by this is the temporal lobes, which is where our emotional center is, but also it actually affects health. And so kids who have these early exposures are at higher risk for chronic disease, for asthma, for cancer, for heart disease, for emotional problems. And some of the newer science is, in fact, showing us that these experiences not only impact brain architecture, but actually impact the cornerstone of the biology in our bodies, which is our chromosomes and our genes, and may, in fact, speed up the aging process, which is enormously concerning. But I also want to caution that that doesn't mean that these events create irrevocable damage. And in fact, when I think about this, I think about it in the context of injury to brains. Injuries can heal, and injuries can be moderated. So it's not permanent damage, but it creates a level of invulnerability that must be attended to. And in fact, there's a cornerstone initiative in the Justice Department now called Defending Childhood, which is a real effort to take this on and to introduce and promote trauma-informed care when we deal with children and when we deal with youth. The second point I want to make is that a lot of young people, and sometimes our highest risk young people, are growing up in communities where they're surrounded by violence. They may not experience the violence themselves, but it's occurring all around them, and that greatly affects their perceptions of the world. And in fact, there are some studies that are beginning to show that rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among teenagers growing up in violent inner-city communities rivals rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in military who are coming back from combat zones. So these kids see the world as a very scary place, as a very unfriendly place, as a mean place, and that also needs to be taken into consideration. Again, this is not irrevocable damage by any means, but it requires us in how we interact with these kids and relate to these kids and serve these kids, that we keep that in mind, that their way of looking at the world may not be the same as ours, and we need to recognize that and respond to that. I think the last thing I want to say is that it's enormously important that we think about the needs of these individual kids as they become involved with the criminal justice system, as they present in various ways. But we also have to understand that we also have to look at the communities they're living in and create strategies that promote systemic change in these communities. Because it's the integration of our individual approaches to these young people and the changes that we support and promote in their communities that are ultimately going to lead to healthy outcomes. And that reflects another important sort of cornerstone initiative in the Justice Department that actually came out of the White House, which is the National Forum for Youth Violence Prevention, which is in fact focused not just on creating individual programs, but really working with cities to promote a different way that services and systems operate so that people and systems work together and collaborate and coordinate as opposed to being siloed and delivering services in their own little pathways without recognizing that the whole spectrum of services in a city and resources in cities can have huge impact on young people. It's not just the criminal justice system, as people have already said this morning, but it's the services in cities that affect what communities physically look like, the built environment. People often behave based on what their environment looks like. And if we have deteriorating infrastructure in cities, what message does that give young people growing up? So there's a whole spectrum of things. It's a very holistic approach, which again has been mentioned, where we look at the communities kids live in, the individual needs of kids, and an understanding of all of that interplay with the developmental factors that influence this. There's been a lot of movement in this. The Justice Department is investing an enormous amount, not just of money, but energy and good thinking in this. And there's a lot more that we still need to do in this. And so I thank you for being here and appreciate your attention.
So it's my privilege and honor to introduce to you a dear friend and colleague, Professor Lawrence Steinberg. As many of you know, Larry's an internationally recognized researcher and scholar and expert on adolescent development and juvenile justice. And Larry, as I said earlier, was the person I turned to when the foundation began grappling with how it could help reverse the tide of the more harsh and punitive sanctions and the changes that we were seeing in law and policy across the country. And Larry at the time was an expert in juvenile justice. However, he did not know, an expert in adolescent development, but he did not know that much about juvenile justice. And I'm pleased to see he had a very steep learning curve and has become very accomplished in the field. The research network, as many of you know, created a very insightful body of knowledge and information, important empirical research that talked about how kids are different from adults and their legal implications. And that research was cited in the Supreme Court decisions, Roper versus Simmons, the Graham decision, and more recently, Miller and Jackson, which have rolled back some of the extreme sentencing of young people, beginning with the elimination of the juvenile death penalty. This work continues to play itself out at the state and local level and here in the halls of Congress as we think about how juveniles make decisions, about their vulnerability, about their capacity for change, and what the implications are then for holding them accountable when they come into conflict with the law. But those implications are profound not only vis-a-vis the law, but how we think about young people in the broader society, how we think about them in our interactions, relationships, engagements with them, whether they're the kid down the block or they're the adolescent who's giving us grief in our own home as our child. So we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude for Larry and his colleagues asking tough questions and pursuing getting us the answers, and then urging us to act on them to improve the lives of all young people in our lives and in our care. So Larry?
I want to thank MacArthur and especially Vera for organizing this event, and thank you all for coming. What I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to change the way that you think about adolescence as a period of life. As Laurie mentioned, I've been a researcher in the field of adolescent development for quite some time, been studying kids for about 40 years, and I'm always struck at the disconnect that exists between what science tells us about adolescent development and what the popular portrayal of adolescence is, and it's that popular portrayal that often influences our social and legal policies toward kids. And I believe that if we could realign those policies and practices in a way that's more consistent with what science tells us about adolescence, we would have far better outcomes for our kids and for our communities and country. If you go to a bookstore and you look in the section where they have books for parents of adolescents, what you're going to see are a lot of survival guides. And most of those books have the word survive or survival in the title. Just last month, a new one came out. It's gotten a lot of press recently, and I was disappointed to see that the subtitle of this book is A Neuroscientist's Survival Guide for Parents. And I think that the survivor's mentality has adversely affected the way we treat kids in the justice system, in the education system, in the mental health system, and adversely affected the way that we as parents and educators and concerned adults interact with young people. There's even a book out there, if you can imagine, called Surviving Your Dog's Adolescence. So this is a cross-species stereotype that exists. And I would submit to you that the survivor's mentality is not working very well, at least in the United States. Compared to most industrialized nations, our high school students fare very poorly on tests of achievement. We are one of the world's leaders in STDs, in adolescent pregnancies, in binge drinking, in illicit drug use, and, as most of you know, in violent crime. So we need to do better. And I think in order to do better, we need a different vision of what adolescence is like. And this is not just important to those of us in the room today. It's not just important to parents and to teachers. It's important to all of us. We all have a stake in making sure that the next generation of young people is competent, happy, confident, and participating members of society. Now, one of the reasons that we should think carefully about adolescence is that as a stage of life, it is much longer today than it's ever been. Some of you may have seen the op-ed in the New York Times yesterday about the declining age of puberty among adolescent girls in America. And there has been a comparable decline in the age of puberty among adolescent boys in America by about 2 years since the beginning of the 20th century. So adolescence begins much earlier now than it did before, And as I describe in the book Age of Opportunity, this is important not only because it makes kids look different or because they're maturing sexually at an earlier age, but we now understand that sex hormones affect the brain in profound ways that have downstream consequences for how kids behave. And these effects are now taking place at a much younger age than they ever have before. And we haven't really caught up with that as a society. And at the same time, it's taking young people longer and longer to become adults, mainly because of economic and social factors. We require and need kids to stay in school longer. That's why it's important to encourage more of them to pursue higher education, because they won't be able to succeed in the labor force without a college degree. What that means, of course, is that this period of time from 18 to 24, 25 is now more like adolescence in many ways than it is like later on in adulthood. And yet our justice system hasn't figured out how to deal with people in this age range. I was giving a talk on this topic at the University of Chicago last month and was asked what we're doing for education of young people exiting the justice system who entered when they were maybe 15 or 16 or coming out when they're 23 or 24. They haven't completed high school, so they can't go right into college. We're not going to start putting 23-year-olds back in high schools. What are we going to do for this population of young people? We've acted historically as if they're just adults like anybody else, but now society has changed in ways that make this age period very different today than it has been in the past. And so a challenge for our justice system is not just how we deal with teenagers, but I think it's also how we deal with this new group of adolescents who really are in their early 20s. If adolescence begins as early as 10 and goes until 25, which is how I think about it, it's too long a period to just think about surviving. I mean, maybe there was a time when adolescence was short enough that we could just think that we could hold our breath and get through it, but not if it's 15 years long. So we need a different approach than one that simply says, all we've got to do is survive this time period. So we need a new vision of what adolescence is. It is true, as Roy and others have said, that this vision has to be based on the proposition that kids are different. But it's more than that. It has to be based on an informed understanding of how kids are different. And this understanding of how adolescents are different from adults should inform juvenile justice policy, because it tells us what people this age need when they're in the custody of the system, and it helps to understand the genesis of the behaviors that might have gotten them into the system to begin with. Adolescent brain science has been around now for 15 years or so. And so we now understand that there are systematic, developmental, predictable changes in the brain that occur during the adolescent and now young adult years. And a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the story that is presented in the popular press about the immature prefrontal cortex as the cause of adolescents' reckless and dumb behaviors. And that is a part of the story, but it's really a small part of the story. And I'm not going to rehash that story here because I think most of you have heard it enough times. Well, I want to tell you about a new part of the story that I think is more important and more exciting and more relevant to the issues that bring us here today. And this new part of the story is that we have now discovered that adolescence is a second period of heightened brain plasticity. It had been thought for a long time, and known for a long time, that the brain is very plastic during the first years of life, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, roughly infancy and early childhood. Brain plasticity refers to the capacity of the brain to change in response to experience, in response to the environment. And because we discovered that the brain was very plastic or very malleable during the early years of life, this stimulated a lot of interest, and I think appropriately so, in programming for infants and toddlers and preschool-age children to take advantage of that brain plasticity, to provide the kinds of experiences that are going to help kids get off to a healthy start and prepare them for entering into elementary school. Well, what does it mean, then, to discover that adolescence is the second time when the brain is once again so highly plastic? It means that it's a second time in life when the brain is easily affected by experience, easily shaped by the environment. That should make us be very, very thoughtful about how we treat people this age. And there's a special urgency here that I think doesn't pertain to the early years. And that urgency is that adolescence is the last time when the brain is ever this plastic. So the brain can always change in response to experience. If it couldn't, we would never be able to learn anything. But we know now that there is a huge drop in brain plasticity between adolescence and adulthood. And scientists have even discovered some of the neurochemical bases for this change in plasticity, and it's pretty well established. So yes, the people in those infomercials that are telling you you can change your brain are saying something that is technically true, but the truth is, once you're an adult, you can't change it all that much. So we really need to take advantage of this window that adolescence provides. Now, when the brain is malleable, as it is early in life and during adolescence, it's not plastic in all parts of the brain at the same time. And the part of the brain that is particularly plastic, particularly malleable during adolescence, is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is important because that's the part of the brain that governs our advanced thinking abilities, and that's the part of the brain that governs a set of psychological characteristics that we call self-regulation or self-control. It's very important that we structure experiences for kids in ways that are going to facilitate stronger self-control and stronger self-regulation. If you're a parent out there and you're wondering, what should I do to help give my kid a better chance in life? The single most important trait to help facilitate is strong self-control. But this has been demonstrated in hundreds and hundreds of studies, that strong self-control is associated with doing better in school, with having better relationships, with having fewer mental health problems, with having fewer behavioral problems. On the other hand, poor self-control is associated with a range of outcomes we really want to protect our kids against. Mental health problems, substance abuse disorders, violence, and aggression. In one of the studies that we did under the imprimatur of the research network that Laurie Garduque talked about, we tracked a sample of juvenile offenders who had been convicted of very serious crimes, felonies, sometime between the age of 14 and 17, and we followed them for 7 years with the support of MacArthur and with the Department of Justice. And we asked which kids keep committing crimes and which kids desist from crime. Because we know that most people don't become career criminals even if they've broken the law as juveniles. And we wanted to see if we could predict, based on what we knew about them when they were 14, 15, 16 years old. Well, the answer is we can't predict very well, but I can tell you that one of the robust predictors of continuing to offend was poor self-control. And if we had to say what's the one single psychological characteristic that distinguishes these serious juvenile offenders who became career criminals, or at least through their mid-20s, from those who desisted from crime, it's poor self-control. And the fact that the part of the brain that regulates self-control is still plastic during adolescence gives us an opportunity to do something to help build and strengthen a characteristic that is not only going to benefit young people in the worlds of school and work, as we know that it does, but it's going to help them continue to live lives that are not criminal in their behavior. It's going to keep them from returning to the justice system. So this then, I think, suggests that brain plasticity during adolescence is a double-edged sword. It's an opportunity, but it's a vulnerability. Because the same features of the brain that make it capable to improve psychological and cognitive functioning for the better also make it easy for the brain to be harmed by exposure to toxic experiences and substances as well. Now, this is a very important point with respect to the kids who come into the justice system. The kids that come into the justice system often come in with problems that make it difficult for them to develop healthy self-control and healthy self-regulation. And these problems often are comorbid or co-occurring with each other. Many of the kids come into the justice system with mental health problems that have their roots in poor self-control and poor self-regulation. Many come in with substance abuse problems that help to create poor self-control and poor self-regulation. Many come in exposed to trauma. And we know that one of the consequences of exposure to trauma early in life is that it impairs the development of prefrontal brain systems which allow people to control their impulses. And so we're dealing with a population of young people that need extra help in developing this crucial psychological capacity. And as I said, this is probably the last time we're going to be able to do something about this in this population of young people. What does this mean for juvenile justice policy and practice? Well, the first is that if brain plasticity creates an opportunity, then it means that juvenile offenders are better candidates for rehabilitation than are people at a later age. And that helps to provide a rationale for having a rehabilitative orientation to juvenile justice rather than a punitive orientation. And let's not kid ourselves. Punishment is not rehabilitation. They're very, very different things with very different consequences. But the type of rehabilitation that we provide to young people in this system matters, because it needs to be rehabilitation that's going to contribute to the strengthening of brain systems that are important for self-control and self-regulation. What are those kinds of experiences? We know that exposing young people to challenge and to novelty helps strengthen those muscles, strengthen those brain muscles. And so then when you think of some of the ways that we treat kids in the system, shackling, solitary, no stimulation in their programming, we are doing the exact opposite of what the brain needs at that point in time. It's really important to get kids out of institutional placements and into schools where they can have the kinds of experiences that are going to facilitate advanced brain development. I mentioned before that we discovered in this longitudinal study of juvenile offenders that poor self-control was one of the strongest predictors of continued offending. We also learned some other lessons in that study that are important for our discussion here today. We were able to compare serious juvenile offenders who were incarcerated with kids who committed the same crimes and had similar records, but who were treated in the community. And what we found was that when those young people who had been locked up were released, and virtually all of them are, the average length of stay was about 6 to 8 months. When those young people are released in the community, they're no less likely to reoffend than the people who were treated in the community to begin with. So there's no advantage to putting kids into incarceration in terms of improving community safety beyond the period of time when you're incapacitating them. And then you have to ask, well, what's happening to them when we're incapacitating them? Because that may be damaging them in other ways. We also looked within the population of kids who had been incarcerated to ask what the relationship is between the length of incarceration and their likelihood of reoffending. And there isn't one. You get the same effect locking somebody up for 3 or 4 months that you do for locking them up for a year or a year and a half. Now, this is a very expensive way to go about protecting our communities, keeping people incarcerated. You're talking about spending, $100,000 a year or more, depending upon what state you live in, per child, and not getting any benefit over what you would get by treating that young person in the community. In a new study that we're currently in the field doing, also funded by MacArthur and OJJDP, a study that we call Crossroads, we're comparing first-time offenders who have been diverted from the justice system with those who have been formally processed. Again, matching the young people on the offense and on background characteristics. We've not finished the study, but I can give you a taste of what we're finding based on the 12-month follow-ups. We have funding to follow them for 3 years. We would like to get funding to follow them for more than 3 years. But after 1 year, what we are seeing is that the kids who are formally processed, now remember, these kids are matched on what got them into the system and on their background characteristics. The kids who are formally processed are more likely to be rearrested. They report higher rates of offending, self-report offending. They are more likely to have had substance abuse problems exacerbated by their association with the justice system. They're more likely to have mental health problems, and they're less likely to be engaged in school, in part because the kinds of schools that they end up in, if they have contact with the justice system, are schools that don't exactly foster engagement between students and the educational institution. So the lessons that we've learned from these two studies so far, one of very serious offenders and one of first-time offenders, I think are quite similar in some ways, which is that contact with the justice system, unfortunately, is toxic to kids. And so we want to keep as many kids out of the system as we can while still protecting the community. And we want to keep kids who need to be in the system from penetrating into it any more deeply than they need to penetrate, again, without compromising the safety of the community. And I think our research and the research of other people in the field shows that that can be done. So I just want to leave you then with this take-home message. The adolescence is another opportunity. It's not just over, as Howard said, in the first 3 years of life. And intervening in the early years is important, but let's remember, it's not an inoculation. And we need to invest in kids at all ages, but especially in adolescence because the brain is as plastic as it is and because it's the last chance that we have to help get their lives back in order. So let's see what we can do about changing juvenile justice policy and practice in a way that's going to take advantage of the opportunity that brain plasticity provides us, but that's not going to exacerbate the vulnerability that it permits and that so many of our young people who come into the system already come in with. Thank you very much.
So I now have the pleasure of introducing Johan Uvin, who is currently is the acting assistant secretary for the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education at the Department of Education. He has been there for some time, since 2009, in a variety of roles. He has served and is serving, I believe, as a member of the steering committee of the Domestic Policy Council's New American Citizenship and Integration Initiative. Back in the day, he led Rhode Island's state office that oversees adult education, career and technical education, and GED testing. And in addition, he has a PhD and 2 master's degrees. The doctorate is in administration planning and social policy, and a master's in international education, as well as a master of the arts in teaching English to speakers of other languages. So I want to welcome now to the podium Dr. Uvin.
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction, and thank you to the Vera Institute of Justice for putting together what I think is a wonderful and very important event, and all of you for your continued focus and interest on improving the outcomes for justice-involved youth. I also do want to acknowledge many individuals who have been part of this program: Bob Listenby, Christine, Laurie, Dr. Steinberg, Roy, Austin, Theron, Pride. It's really an honor for me to be part of a program that involves such a distinguished group of thought leaders, policymakers, and advocates in this area of work. So in the time that I have with you today, I'd like to touch on some of the root causes from our perspective at the Department of Education leading to youth contact with the justice system. And in addition to that, I want to focus on what the Department of Education and its federal partners are actually doing to plug the school-to-prison pipeline and the work that still needs to be done from our perspective to provide at-risk and justice-involved youth with pathways to what we've called a high-quality education and career opportunities for them. So let me start by talking a little bit about the challenges related to school discipline. While youth crime and incarceration rates are down, and down significantly in some states, zero-tolerance policies that criminalize minor infractions of school rules have unnecessarily exposed students to the justice system. Data suggests that young students who are expelled or suspended are as much as 10 times more likely to drop out of high school, experience academic failure and grade retention, hold negative school attitudes, and face incarceration from those who are not. Unfortunately, a significant number of students are removed from class each year, even for minor infractions of school rules. One study has found that 95% of out-of-school suspensions were for nonviolent minor disruptions, such as being late or displaying disrespect. Furthermore, exclusionary discipline practices tend to disproportionately impact students of color and students with disabilities. So nationwide, data collected by our Office for Civil Rights show that African American students are suspended and expelled at a rate 3 times greater than white students. While black students represent 16% of student enrollment, they represent 27% of students referred to law enforcement and 31% of students subjected to a school-related arrest. Looking at gender, while boys more than 2 out of 3 represent more than 2 out of 3 suspensions received, black girls are suspended at higher rates, 12% specifically, than girls of any other race or ethnicity, and most boys. So although students who receive special education services represent 12% of students in the country, they make up 19% of students suspended in school, 20% of students receiving out-of-school suspension once, 25% of students receiving multiple out-of-school suspension, 19% of students expelled, 23% of students referred to law enforcement, and 23% of students receiving a school-related arrest. Clearly, these data, these trends are disturbing, and they warrant more attention, more immediate attention from the education field as a whole to prevent and severely limit and work towards eventually eliminating the unnecessary expulsion and suspension of students. So that's the problem on the school discipline side. So turning to some solutions, in order to weaken the school-to-prison pipeline, educators and administrators really must ensure that clear, consistent, and appropriate expectations and consequences are in place to prevent and address misbehavior. Last year, our department, in partnership with the Department of Justice, released the first ever guidance on school discipline. The guidance, which draws from emerging research and best practices, describes how schools can meet their obligations under federal law to administer student discipline without discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Furthermore, the department also released guiding principles to help state and locally controlled efforts to improve school climate and school discipline. And additionally, as you may be aware of, the department is currently providing technical assistance, identifying districts for enforcement, and is engaging educators at the state and district levels about best practices in promoting quality school climates that actually foster a culture of support and high expectations at the same time. But it's clear that this is important work, but it is not enough. Much more is needed. Schools must better understand their civil rights obligations, and they must strive to ensure fairness and equity for all the students by continuously evaluating the impact of their discipline policies and practices on all students. And they should do that using data and the analysis of the data that they gather. I want to say something specifically about the challenges facing foster youth. Foster youth, of which you know there are approximately 400,000, of which between 20 and 25,000 transition out of the system on an annual basis. They are particularly vulnerable to entering the justice system. Overlap between the foster care and juvenile justice system is common. We often refer to those youth as crossover youth, and it is common as these young people who come from often very unstable environments, face poverty on a daily basis and other harmful situations, are actually at increased risk of entering both systems. Many young people are actually leaving the foster care or juvenile justice system having a very, very difficult time making a successful transition to adulthood and independent living. And particularly when youth emancipate, depending on the state policies that may be in place, the likelihood that a successful transition takes place can vary greatly. So we must, in this whole conversation, pay particular attention, we believe, to the unique educational and support, social support needs of foster youth and those that have aged out of the system. So speaking of solutions regarding this, in November, you may be aware that the Departments of Education, Labor, Health and Human Services, along with the Corporation for National and Community Service and the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences announced an innovative approach to improving the outcomes for disconnected youth with a particular interest in the foster youth, homeless youth, and the juvenile justice youth subpopulations, to give states, state governments, local governments, and tribal governments the flexibility to pool most of their non-mandatory funding to put together interventions that would allow them to improve the outcomes of disconnected youth. The final subpopulation and related issues that I wanted to address are the youth who are actually already just as involved. We know that many youth are already involved in the justice system and that they face many more barriers to obtaining high-quality education that would offer real pathways to post-secondary opportunities and degree attainment and subsequent meaningful employment. For example, educational options available to incarcerated youth, we have learned, vary tremendously, both in scope and in quality. And so for this population to be successful as they exit the juvenile justice system, and by that I mean that they would not recidivate, they actually need access to education and employment opportunities of very, very high quality. And some of the great research that has taken place over the last couple of years has indicated that career-oriented education and training programs are actually an extremely effective intervention for these young individuals. So turning to some of the solutions for this population from our perspective, we really believe that we should maximize the opportunities for youth to develop their skills so that when they actually re-enter school or the community, that they will have one of the most powerful assets with them, which is a skill set that will actually allow them to be successful. Some of the ways that we're working on this issue at the Department of Education and in conjunction with our federal partners involve helping to bridge that gap between incarceration or institutionalization and reentry into the community or reconnecting with opportunities for education and training. In 2014, our Secretary and the Attorney General released a joint letter that outlined what the high-quality features of education services for youth who are confined in long-term secure care facilities should look like. What are these actual features? This was very well received, and I see that some of you are in the audience here actually were contributors to in the process of helping us identify what those characteristics are. The Department's Office of Special Education Programs has launched a reentry demonstration initiative focused on juvenile justice learners with disabilities, who actually comprise an estimated 40% of the students in correctional facilities. There will be 3 of these projects, and each will be funded for a 4-year period. And the goal of these projects is refining and evaluating models that facilitate the successful reentry of these youth with significant disabilities. I'm delighted that we are able to continue our partnership with the Department of Justice around reentry education programming, and we will later this year, by summer, issue 2 competitions. One is to expand our demonstration projects for adult reentry education programs, and we are very excited that we are going to have an opportunity to organize a competition to solicit ideas for demonstration projects focused specifically on reentry education issues for JJ kids. We're super excited about this. Final thing I wanted to mention is a guidance that we have released just recently that clarified that youth in juvenile justice facilities are actually eligible for federal Pell Grants if they meet certain criteria. While this guidance clearly is a step in the right direction, we also need to spur a lot more state-level innovation to expand post-secondary opportunities for detained youth. And I think we could look at some exciting examples that are out there. The Texas Juvenile Justice Department has partnered, for instance, with Navarro Community College to help youth in 5 secure facilities and 3 halfway houses to participate in college classes using technology, using 2-way video and audio feeds. So we hope that we can replicate and encourage this type of model. Just to give you a sense, last academic year in this particular initiative in Texas, students were able to complete, I'm not saying access, they were able to complete 602 college courses as a result of this initiative, which is quite exciting. So in closing, collectively, I think we can help youth who have been or are at risk of being involved in the criminal justice system rebuild their lives, We believe that we can help them reclaim their sense of purpose and direction. We think we can, through our reentry efforts, facilitate them rejoining society in a productive way. And we most certainly believe that there are many initiatives that we can collectively pursue so that these young individuals can realize their full potential. And we have come to see that one of the foundations of all this work is actually a high-quality educational opportunity with a strong set of wraparound support services that they can access at the same time. And we believe that if we do all these things collectively, that not only the young person will be much better off, but that their families, their friends, and ultimately their communities will benefit from their newly acquired success. So thank you for your attention. And again, it was a true privilege to be able to be part of this event this morning.
Thank you, Johan, for your remarks. I think we've had a series of speakers that have pointed out to us how juvenile justice change, improvement, and reform involves a variety of systems, and that we're better positioned to make those changes given the body of knowledge that has been acquired over the last several years, where we have well-documented interventions, programs, and services with a strong evidence base about what works. I think the challenge is deciding which kids at what time should have what kinds of services to do the least amount of harm, to hold them accountable, treat them fairly, and help them get on the right track. We all stand to benefit from having a just system for all. And with respect to that, it certainly has been an undercurrent in much of what we've been talking about today is the racial and ethnic disparities that arise in the justice system, and that the harm that we've been talking about disproportionately falls on the burden is borne by young people of color, their families and their communities. It was in part a major reason for why MacArthur went into the juvenile justice field, was our concern for racial and social justice. And in thinking about those issues and looking at the data and information had been gathered, and the importance and value of the core requirements in tracking what those problems are with respect to JJDPA, we saw less attention being paid to actually figuring out how to respond appropriately. And that we didn't want to play the blame game. It was important to us to look at the data and information and figure out what appropriate responses could be made, and to work with the people in the system to institute those policies and practices that would ensure young people of color are treated fairly and justly. So as part of my education and learning curve, I turned to the experts and immediately sought out the Youth Law Center and the Burns Institute and a number of legal and policy advocacy groups, and met Mark Soler. And that's my privilege today, is to introduce to you Mark. Mark currently is the executive director for the Center for Children's Law and Policy. As I noted, prior to joining CCLP, he was at the Youth Law Center and worked as a legal and policy advocate across the country and litigating on child welfare issues, mental health issues, conditions of confinement, civil rights issues. He's received numerous awards from various professional and policy organizations and groups. He continues to teach law and inspire other young attorneys to move into this field. And he's been a proud participant in our work and Models for Change now for well over a decade. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Mark Soler.
I want to thank Christine and Nick and Vera for inviting me. Since Laurie mentioned my teaching, I have to say we have international representation here. One of my former students, I teach at American University seminar on juvenile justice, and one of my former students who's from Kenya is working for us as a legal intern during this semester, and she's here. She's learning about the juvenile justice system in the United States, and this is a great place to learn part of how that works. We do a 5-day training, intensive training on race and ethnicity in the juvenile justice system at Georgetown, along with Shea Bilchik and the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. And either I'm going to talk very fast like this to cover the whole amount, or I'm just going to make a couple of comments that I think will just hit some of the key points. The issue of racial disparities and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, of course, has been well known for decades, long before the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and the others that we've followed in the newspaper. So many people have felt a sense of outrage, frustration, and sometimes helplessness, I think, as a result of following those events, that there is a tendency to think, oh my God, this is so horrible, it's so pervasive, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I don't want anybody to leave this room today thinking there's nothing we can do about it, because there actually is. And that's what I want to talk about. There are just a couple of facts that you can learn to give you a sense of what the scope of the problem is. A little over a third of the adolescents in the United States are young people of color, particularly talking about African Americans and Latinos. About a third of the population, but about 2/3 of those who are locked up. So it's an easy piece of data and tells us there's something going on that we ought to be concerned about. The research shows that young white adolescents are treated more harshly than, that youth of color are treated more harshly than white adolescents at the points of arrest, detention, transfer to adult court, and commitment to state facilities, even when they're charged with the same offenses. So we're comparing apples and apples rather than comparing apples and oranges. And unfortunately, over the last several decades, the federal government has not really gotten very far in trying to address this issue. The National Research Council reported in their 2013 report, and I quote, "Despite a research and policy focus on this matter for more than 2 decades, remarkably little progress has been made on reducing the disparities themselves or in reaching scholarly consensus on the root sources of these disparities." In the last 10 years, 2 foundations have really led the way. Laurie's talked about the MacArthur Foundation, which has done a tremendous has given tremendous support for work to explore reforms in this area and see if they work on the ground. So the foundation required that every jurisdiction working as models for change in the original 4 states had to work on reducing racial and ethnic disparities. It wasn't one of the high priorities for some of those jurisdictions, but the foundation felt it was so important, the president of the foundation felt it was so important that they had to work on it. The foundation also supported a DMC, Disproportionate Minority Contact Action Network, which brought in 4 other states. And my organization coordinated all that work. So we worked in 17 jurisdictions in 8 states. We've since taken the lessons that we learned there and have applied them in the 4 major cities in Connecticut and in a number of other jurisdictions around the country. The other foundation is the Annie Casey Foundation through its Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. Casey Foundation now operates in 300 sites in 39 states. And one of the core strategies that they work on is reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And I think the work that MacArthur and Casey have supported over the last 10 years has really led us to understand what kinds of strategies actually can make a difference in this area. And my organization is part of both initiatives, Models for Change and JDAI. We get funding from both foundations and have for a considerable period of time and hope to continue that way. And among the sites that we have worked in and that the Haywood Burns Institute has worked in and other organizations, Vera has done work in this issue. There are really many, many examples of jurisdictions that have successfully reduced racial and ethnic disparities. So it's not like we're making it up or we're doing this on a theoretical basis. We're talking about work that actually goes on the ground, and we talk about counting measurable changes. We want to count the number of children whose lives are benefited by the work that we do. This is a very difficult issue to work on. We make lists of the ways that people don't work on it and categorize them. One way is avoidance of the discussion. Very often when we start talking about this, the response we get is, this is a class issue, and as soon as we solve the problem of poverty, the racial disparities will go away. Great. That problem ain't going to get solved in my lifetime or my younger colleagues' lifetime, and it's a way of just avoiding getting at the underlying issue. Another way that people avoid it is denial that there is any problem. We often hear people, often prosecutors, saying, I look at each case individually, and so how can there be any bias involved in the decision making? And that's when the data show that there's a clear pattern that prosecutors are biased or show bias in their decisions. In Memphis, Tennessee, that Roy Austin talked about, I work there as part of JDAI and have been working there for a couple of years. The Department of Justice report found that prosecutors were actually offering better deals, better plea bargains to white young people compared to black youth when they came in on the same charges. They were able to look at it that carefully. So there clearly is bias that goes on. Another way that people avoid talking about this is defensiveness, and that usually comes out is, our officers are not racist, so what's the problem? Some people get distracted. One group we work with took 6 months to decide on a name for the group. Some people said, well, if we say it's the group to reduce racial disparities, isn't that a violation of the civil rights laws? No, it's not. People also talk about the blame game that Laurie talked about. Blame the parents, blame the news media, blame Hollywood, blame gangster rap, blame social media, blame anybody you want to. It doesn't get us anywhere in moving forward. And our friends at the Burns Institute talk about the culture of politeness. That is, in discussions about this, everyone is afraid of offending somebody else in the room by talking about race, and therefore no one says anything that's honest, especially something honest about race. So the recent report by the Council for State Governments on the Texas reforms is an illustration of some of the things that I'm talking about, and I just wanted to talk about that. I didn't know if anybody would mention that before me, since I'm last. So it's a report that you ought to know about by the Council for State Governments Justice Center. They looked at the reforms that took place in the state of Texas from 2007 to 2012. They found that through a series of reforms, including prohibiting youth charged with misdemeanors from being held in state facilities, and by providing money to local probation departments, they were able to reduce the population in state commitment facilities by 2/3. A very considerable reduction, and thereby close 8 state institutions and thereby save almost $180 million. It's really a tremendous effort. The report is very good. You should read it. There's a good executive summary that you can read. The report did touch on the issue of racial and ethnic disparities, and what they found was that with all of this effort that was put in and all the careful monitoring, it's one of the biggest reports ever done in terms of the database, more than 1.3 million cases that were available to look at the data in. They found that there was essentially no change in the disproportionality of African American and Latino youth who went into the system and went into commitments. The numbers went down. There were fewer African Americans committed in 2008 compared to 2005, and fewer in 2012 compared to 2008, and fewer Latino youth and fewer white youth, but the differentials stayed exactly the same. There were still grossly disproportionate African American youth committed to state facilities, and many more Latino youth committed than white youth. And when I read that, I was disappointed, to say the least. And it's really a sobering finding for a study that was so carefully done and advised by people who have done very good research in this field. But for those of us who work in this area all the time, there are two other ways to look at the issues that took place in Texas with regard to race and ethnicity. One is, was there actually disparate treatment that went on? That is, were children of color treated differently than white youth when they were similarly situated, when they were charged with the same kind of offense? That was not covered in the report, and I think that's unfortunate because I think it probably could have been. The data they collected was so voluminous and so comprehensive that they could have done that. And that's really important. When I started doing this work 15 years ago, leading an initiative called Building Blocks for Youth, we found that people are not especially interested in whether there is disproportionality. If you, I always talk, if you go home for the holidays and talk to your Uncle Fred, everybody has an Uncle Fred, and you say, I heard somebody talking about racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile justice system, and he said, children of color are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. Uncle Fred is likely to say, of course they are, because they commit more crimes. And that's the way the system works. However, if you go and say that African-American children are almost 5 times as likely to go into the system for the same kinds of offenses as white children, people understand it in a very different way. They understand the issue of unfairness. Because it's comparing apples and apples. And it's necessary to do that kind of research and look at that kind of data, I think, in order to really understand what the issue is all about. The second additional way that we look at the system is whether there has been unnecessary entry or unnecessary penetration into the juvenile justice system by youth of color. And there, I think we do have some encouraging information from Texas. During the period of the Texas reforms, they decreased the juvenile commitments a total of 65%, from 4,305 to 1,481, a difference of 2,824 youth. The percentages of categories of race and ethnicity did not change. But every one of those 2,824 youth who didn't go into state facilities in Texas are living better lives. Their families are living better lives. Every one of those children now has a much better chance to become productive citizens, get started right again in our communities, and the system has not taken their lives away, has really given them a chance. And so I think it's very important for us to look at who doesn't go into the system because of these reforms. So from our experience and from the research, I think a couple of lessons are clear. One is that racial bias and racial disparities are very difficult to talk about, very difficult to address, and very difficult to engage state and local jurisdictions in working on. However, led by MacArthur and by the Casey Foundation, their initiatives, and I give a shout out to my friends and colleagues at the Haywood Burns Institute in San Francisco, which has done a lot of pioneering work in this area. We really have developed ways of reducing these disparities. And there are some very hopeful signs on the federal level. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has now funded a Racial and Ethnic Disparities Reduction Training and Technical Assistance Center. The Burns Institute is the grantee, and my organization is the subcontractor, so we're working on it together. And it's an effort to really rethink and sort of start again, thinking about how the federal government can help local and state jurisdictions in reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And we've had our first meetings. Believe me, we are at the beginning stage of this, but we have high hopes for the future, and there clearly is a strong commitment by the Justice Department, not just as the administrator at OJJDP, but through Carol Mason at OJP, and all the way up the line to the White House. The second is that S 2999, the juvenile justice bill introduced in the last session, includes amendments to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act that would for the first time, require strategies that we know are effective. And these are the strategies, some of the strategies that we've developed in working on this issue. Having coordinating bodies to monitor and oversee the activities. Somebody has to be in charge. Anybody who tells you that we can do other kinds of reforms and the racial issues will get better as a sidelight is telling you that they don't want to really grapple with this issue. And it really isn't going to happen. There has to be an intentional focus and somebody holding people accountable to be able to reduce these kinds of disparities. Second, that there's a focus on key decision points in the system. The system is not an assembly line. The system is a series of key decision points where there's a person or persons who makes a decision whether the child will go deeper into the system or will get diverted out or will go into some other kind of program. We have to look at each of those decision points and understand what decisions are made, what criteria are used for those decisions, and then what the impacts are on young people. Third is data collection and analysis. Anyone who talks to you about reducing racial disparities without starting the discussion by talking about data is not going to get very far. Trying to develop policy by anecdote doesn't get you anywhere because you often have conversations and when you start like that, someone says, well, I had an unfortunate experience with X. And you know what? Everybody has had an unfortunate experience with X. That really doesn't help us at all. We need to have regular data collection and analysis to understand where the problems are, and then to understand, once we put in interventions, whether they are successful or not. S2999 also includes work plans with measurable objectives. That is really critical. Very often, the efforts that people have end up with the results of, well, we thought we had gotten the word out to the community, or to the business community, or to the inner city community. We thought there was more understanding of what the problem is. That's fine. But if we're talking about reform, let's talk about reform. We need to be able to measure the impact of the work that we do. And then the bill requires public reporting of what states do. That's the path to accountability. There are other things that we do, other strategies that are very effective that are not in the section on reducing racial and ethnic disparities in S2999, but are in other parts of the bill. So, using objective screening and assessment instruments to determine what the risk level is, risk of recidivism for kids, that is whether they can be safely supervised in the community or whether they have to be incarcerated, is very important. Having alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to detention and alternatives to commitment that provide supervision to keep the community safe, but also provide the interventions that children need in their lives is a very important part of these strategies. And then regular monitoring of what the influence is of the reform strategies. We really need to know if the numbers go down. If they don't go down, we're not doing the right thing. And this list of strategies that I've talked about is hardly foolproof. There were some places in the MacArthur network where I had 2 staff people try to work on this. I tried. I got all of my friends in the state to try. We simply could not move the needle on it. We just were not able to accomplish anything, and we were very frustrated, and it was a problem. In other places, enormous success. In Berks County, Pennsylvania, Reading, Pennsylvania, we looked at this, we collected data, we developed interventions. The foundation helped to start an evening reporting center for supervision of kids after school. It was picked up by the state. After that, it was so successful that the state made money available for other communities in Pennsylvania to start their evening reporting centers with a screening instrument. Berks County today does not have a juvenile detention facility. They got the population down from 54 into the 30s, into the 20s, into single digits. At that point, there's no reason to run a big facility like that. They really have about 3 or 4 kids a day in detention, and they're in the next county over. We call that a success. Huge number of kids, and we can count the number of kids who are not locked up every day. So these things work, and with MacArthur's support, our office is going to be publishing online a comprehensive practice manual on how to reduce racial and ethnic disparities. It's a little bit overdue, but it's going to be coming soon in about a month and a half. And it'll all be online with links to other websites and research and studies like that, and we hope it'll be a very helpful resource in the field. Thank you very much.
Mark, well, I look forward to that resource. You have been in this field for a long time. I've learned quite a bit from you, and while the report may be overdue, as you told us and as we know, it's a timeless issue. So when the report does come out, we have a lot of work to do ahead. So this is it, folks. As you know, this is the final event in the series that we put together, The State of Juvenile Justice, a national conversation about results, research, and reform. I mentioned at the top of the discussion that this is a 6-month process, 9 different events. We have this, this final fascinating, important engagement. We began with a kickoff and then had 7 deep dive discussions on particular issues that were of great importance. We're so pleased that those of you in the room today and that others who are watching by stream and others that would come to the various briefings were able to take some knowledge from it, to learn from the remarkable work that has been supported over the past years. I have a few thank yous that I'd like to offer up before we close. First and foremost, I want to thank Senator Casey, Representative Cardenas, and Representative Kennedy, all of whom joined various of the briefings. I think that Senator Casey deserves a special singling out because of his leadership to address the detention of status offenders in federal legislation, which is something that those of us at Vera hold dear as being a really important issue to focus on, and that my colleagues in the Youth Justice Program have been working on for close to a decade. We started this work in New York counties and have been delighted to continue it under the models for change. We also really need to thank Senators Grassley, Leahy, and Whitehouse, and Congressman Bobby Scott for the support that they have given us over the course of these discussions, and of course to the congressional staff that have taken time to come here to absorb important information and to learn and to think about how they can apply it in their work going forward. And I'll offer a final thanks to Laurie Garduque and to her colleagues at the MacArthur Foundation. I have to say, as I am a refugee from philanthropy. I worked at the Rockefeller Foundation for about 7 years. For those of us who have been in philanthropy and have thought about, that have had the privilege of being able to support important issues of work and to think about how to take private resources and move them into the field in order to change ideas, to change practices, to change policy. It's a privilege, and it sounds like a fun thing. It is a very hard thing to do and to do well. And I think that Models for Change is a wonderful example, as those of you know from just today, or know from the previous briefings, or know from the long history that it has had of a foundation initiative that has changed ideas, has moved the way people think, has changed policy at the local, state, and federal level, and has managed to do that in a way so that when, as Laurie mentioned, MacArthur will be exiting the space, but I think has exited it very responsibly, and the field is stronger as a result of it, and those of us who are in this room are smarter as a result of it, and I think that we owe a great deal of gratitude, and the young people of this country owe a great deal of gratitude to MacArthur for this work. So thank you for that, Laurie. So we now know, although I think everyone in this room knew before, listening to Dr. Steinberg, that young people are different. But the phenomenon that he talked about, this second period of plasticity, is such an important one for us to focus on. And we know that the Supreme Court has, in a number of its rulings, relied a lot upon these concepts in order to change the law, whether it's around the death penalty or parole, life sentences without parole. And the big question for us is whether those of us in the room also have periods of plasticity going forward and can think about how we are able to be informed and shaped and change the world of policy and practice for the benefit of young people and really for the benefit of the future of this country going forward. So the question is, like, what are the next steps? And as those of you know from the architecture of this briefing series, there are a number that are very important. You know, we shouldn't over-incarcerate. We should think about how to reduce system contact only for those young people who are the most serious offenders. We need to provide treatment for those young people who have behavioral and mental health needs. For kids in the system, we need to figure out how they can connect with family and how they can return to community in a constructive and effective way. We need to ensure that the agencies and that the players in the system are working in an interdependent fashion and that they're collaborative. And we need to ensure that young people have access to quality and appropriate counsel and representation where they need it. That's it's a tall order, but it's something that we've been working on for years, that the field has been working on for years, and the evidence base is there to support it, and people are carrying that knowledge forward. So that's what we'll do. We're going to go forward. And so I want to thank you again, all of you, for coming to participate in this event today, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you on this most important issue in the future. Thanks again.